the example of the Saudi royal family and many sheikhs in Yemen, where he had come from, men who took multiple wives and had many children by them. But he took that example to extremes, even by Arabian standards. He wasn't the only prominent sheikh in the peninsula at that time who did so, but it was not, on the other hand, common to do what he did, which was he married at least 22 times, probably more than that, and by these wives had 54 children, 29 daughters and 25 sons. Each time one of his wives became pregnant, he recognized her as legitimate, and he recognized the children as legitimate, and he treated them all, according to Islamic law, as equals. But there were sort of two classes in an informal sense of children. There were a couple of senior wives who stayed married to him for many years, decades, and bore a number of children and lived with him on a big compound. And then there were other wives, and Osama's mother was such a wife, who were typically married to him for a short period of time, perhaps a couple or 3 years. And then after the divorce, he would arrange for the wife's remarriage to someone with a good income, often a manager in his own company. And so there were many children who were essentially singleton sons or daughters of short-lived marriages. And yet they were not outcasts or discriminated against in law or even in the way he organized his family. They just had a somewhat lesser status than the children of the senior wives.
And who was Osama bin Laden closest to of his brothers and sisters?
Well, he had two families, in effect, because his mother remarried a manager in Mohammed bin Laden's company and then had a rather conventional, by Saudi standards, nuclear family in a suburb in Jeddah, where Osama was the stepchild, as the mother now had 4 or 5 children by this more conventional marriage. And so Osama was a member of that household, the special child, whose inheritance, whose allowance of several $100,000 a year, whose status as a son of Mohammed bin Laden conferred great privilege on this stepfamily. And at the same time, he was a member of the larger Mohammed bin Laden family, which would gather on more formal occasions on weekends. The father would teach them the Quran, take them into the desert, teach them the values that he wanted to convey to his sons. And so Osama had these two families. In the larger Mohammed bin Laden family, he was eventually close to his elder brother Salam, who ran the family after Mohammed's death in an airplane crash in 1967. And Salam and Osama were a very odd pair, because Salam was a very westernized, secular character, and Osama, after middle school, became an increasingly devout and eventually radicalized Islamist.
So talk about that trajectory that Osama bin Laden took and where it took him.
Well, as a child, he went, we don't know every year of his schooling, but possible to get a glimpse of him being sent off to boarding school at a Quaker school in Lebanon, where a number of his siblings went. That didn't seem to take at about age 8 or 9. Perhaps he just didn't like being away from home. In any event, he came back to Jeddah and enrolled at about age 12 or 13 in the only truly international standard school in Saudi Arabia, a prep school, a day school in Jeddah, called the Al-Faghr Model School, and it was modeled on a British boarding school. The boys, it was all boys, and the boys wore gray slacks and blue blazers, and they assembled on the yard every morning, and they played soccer, and they had teachers from England and Ireland to teach them English, and they had a modern scientific and math curriculum. And in that school, some of the teachers were Syrians and Egyptians affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, an international sort of Islamist network started as an anti-colonial movement in Egypt. By the time that Osama encountered these teachers, it was a sort of a source of organizing and political dissent in the Arab world, built around Islamist revolutionary ideas. Hamas today is an expression of the Muslim Brotherhood, to get a sense of its character. And these teachers typical of the way the Muslim Brotherhood worked, looked for elite students and recruited them at school in after-school study groups. And Osama was recruited by his Syrian gym teacher into such a group at about age 13 or 14, and was essentially radicalized there, being taught a particularly political form of conservative Islamic theology. That's the difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and, say, normal Saudi conservative orthodoxy, is that the Brotherhood has a political vision of changing governments, and Osama was indoctrinated in those views from a young age.
So how did Osama bin Laden, Steve Coll, end up in Afghanistan?
Through the Brotherhood, essentially. After he was recruited through these study groups, he became part of a Brotherhood clique at his high school. His prep school had cliques like our schools, and there was essentially a Nasserite secular group, and then there was a Muslim Brotherhood conservative group, and he was in the latter and prominent in it. And through his contacts in the Brotherhood after the Soviet invasion of 1979, he gradually became part of the sort of international networks of volunteers who, through the Brotherhood's connections and transnational sort of proselytizing and political networks, he traveled to Pakistan, initially to provide humanitarian aid and to participate in Brotherhood-organized support networks for the Afghan refugees who were pouring out of Soviet-occupied Afghanistan. So that's where he began.
And training with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where did he get the support? Talk about his relationship with the United States, and then we'll talk about a trip he took to buy arms with his brother in England.
Well, his one thing to keep in mind about his involvement in the Afghan war during the 1980s, and I was really reminded of this in the research for this book, even though I've been sort of working on his biography on and off for 15 years, there was a way in which I think until this round of research I didn't quite appreciate, that in Saudi terms, in the 1980s, when he was participating in the Afghan war, working with the Mujahideen, he was an entirely orthodox figure. I mean, this was an entirely authorized effort up until 1989 or so. So he was there under the good graces of his family. With his family's support, they provided him money. They provided channels of importing construction equipment. They provided company engineers to support his work on the frontier. And the government, the Saudi government, supported him as well. The bin Ladens by the 1980s were sort of the Halliburton of Saudi Arabia. They had a tradition of doing no-bid contracts on sensitive defense and intelligence projects. In the 60s, they had built the entire kingdom's defense infrastructure along the Yemen border during a war with Egypt, and in Afghanistan they were doing the same thing. There was a lot of government support for what he was doing.
And didn't they have U.S. support also?
They had U.S. support, but it was sort of running in parallel. The U.S. And the Saudis made an agreement at the beginning of the war to match each other's support dollar for dollar. Much of the official Saudi government cash support was funneled through the CIA, which then passed it through the Pakistan Army and intelligence services, which then passed it on to the Afghan Mujahideen.
And these are the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets.
Fighting the Soviets. But the Saudi government, in addition to that sort of formal channel of aid that passed from government to government and finally ended up in the hands of Pakistani intelligence for distribution to fighters, ISI. In addition to that, the Saudis had their own unilateral channel of support, and Osama seems to have fit in that channel, where they had, in addition to that which ran through the army in Pakistan, their own clients, their own projects, their own priorities. And some of this was religious volunteerism, and some of it was semi-government policy, and some of it was the Saudi intelligence service just working its own networks on the Afghan frontier, and that's where Osama and his family, I think, primarily fit during the 1980s.
And Osama bin Laden's views toward the United States at that time?
There's not a ton of evidence about